forward to. All right, people are coming in right now. Good to see you all. Thank you all so much for joining for our webinar. We're here to talk about coding today. I hope we're all here for the same reason, but today we're going to be talking with some of our friends at Eduscape about how coding isn't a discipline that lives on its own little island. It's something that you can use kind of across disciplines at your school to help build engagement among students, build 21st century skills, enrich the learning experience, whether you're in a math classroom or the gymnasium. There are ways that you can use coding everywhere in school. So a lot of people are still coming in. We'll just give it another minute or so. Throughout the session, I'll be moderating the chat for any of your questions. So please just, as they pop up in your mind, just put them in the chat. I'll make sure that our speakers get them at the end. And to kind of like warm up the chat, why don't you just toss in there where are we all coming in from today? I'm in Minneapolis. Jessica and Erin, you're in New Jersey?
Yes, we are.
Yep, we're here in Montville, New Jersey.
Awesome. All right. So like I said, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please pop them in the chat. At the end of the session, we will have a Q&A and we'll make sure all of your questions get to the speakers. We're also going to have a little very, very short exit survey that'll be kind of how we know that you're interested in getting coffee, because if you didn't know this, it's a coffee and combo session, so you'll get a Starbucks gift card at the end of this if you stick around and do that survey. So I'll pass it over to our great speakers from Eduscape. We have Jessica, Schulte, and Erin Saylor. So you guys can just take it away.
Great. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to see us today. Oh, we have people all over the place. That's cool. So today we're going to be talking about coding across the curriculum. Just to kind of start off with what our time together is going to look like. We're going to start off with a really quick warm up. We're going to talk about what coding is, what it looks like in the classroom and outside of the classroom, and how it really is something that is everywhere around us, not just in particular areas that we think it might be. We're going to talk about how our coding skills can be put into different spaces, including the classroom and beyond, what it could look like in the space that you're a part of, and then we're going to close out with some Q&A, some next steps beyond that. So we're excited to get started. So just to introduce ourselves, my name is Jessica Schulte. I spent the last 10 years as an elementary educator in 3rd grade. I actually just left the classroom back in June. So I hope everybody's having a good year so far. If you're working in a school district, working with educators, however it is that you are interacting with the education world.
And I'm Erin Saylor, and I was a special education teacher predominantly in middle school and high school, and I've taught many grades and subjects. And I taught in a co-teaching setting, mostly in a humanities course. So it was English and history, but as some of you might be new to coding or working in other STEM fields, but we're both kind of coming today with teachers that didn't necessarily have this background, and excited to share with you how coding can really be coded into any curriculum in any educational space.
And kind of going off of that too, if you want to in the chat, I know everybody's telling us where they're from, which looks like we've got some really great places over there. Let us know kind of what your role is, either in your school district, the space that you're in, what is it that you are doing for our education world and beyond right now. You can throw that in the chat so that we can kind of get an idea of the people that we're talking to today. So we want to just kind of talk about how coding really is something that is all around us. And as we get started with that, the first thing we want to do is get everybody kind of warmed up, thinking about when you hear that word coding, what comes to mind? What kind of associations do you have with that word? What kind of knowledge are you bringing to today's webinar? What kind of feelings are you bringing? So as you're telling us your position, you can also tack on some of that knowledge, those feelings, those associations. We'll give everybody a second to get some of those answers into our chat. We'll kind of shout them out as we see them coming through. Okay, great. Oh, we've got technology coordinators. Awesome. Great. Yep. Intimidating can be a popular word, I think, that comes along with coding. Whether you're a student, an adult. It
definitely was for me, because I didn't know, I knew what the word coding meant in a sense, but I didn't know where you do it, how you do it, or how difficult it was. It just sounded really ominous. So Happy to talk you all through a little bit more about coding. And also we're joined today by our coding buddy, Photon, the Photon coding robot. So we'll show how the robot supports making this a bit easier too.
Yeah, so I see intimidating there. Oh, ed tech specialist, hello. That's great. So too, thinking about whether it be students, whether it be adult learners, some of the things that do come to mind when we hear coding are things like intimidation or having specific things that kind of come to mind almost stereotypically of what coding can be. So let's talk a little bit about what coding might not necessarily be, some of the preconceived notions that we might have about it. So one of the things that we want to make pretty clear is that coding doesn't just have to happen in math or the sciences. That's typically where people associate it. They associate it with jobs that have to do with math and sciences, but it doesn't necessarily just have to live in that space. It's not only for people on TV shows who are solving crimes. I'm a big TV show watcher. So I always think of the person that sits in the dark room that's typing away on the computer with all the numbers and the little green symbols all over the computer. And that's not exactly what coding is. It could be a type of coding, but it doesn't necessarily represent all the things that coding does for us, not necessarily just in education, but also in the professional scope. And it's not necessarily just a series of numbers or words on a black computer screen. I think the first time, and Erin, I don't know if you also shared this, one of the first times I remember hearing about coding was like way back when I was in elementary school, and I only saw a picture of zeros and ones on a black computer screen, and that was it. That was the only thing I knew about it.
Like the Matrix.
Yes, yeah, that was probably what it was. I think that might have been green, not white numbers and everything. So it's there are definitely preconceived notions that we come to coding with. So what can coding be? Coding can be the ability to build sequential sets of events that navigate to a desired outcome. So that kind of makes it a little bit bigger. We're not just talking about entering something into a computer and getting a result out. We're starting to think about how you have to sequence certain things. It has to be events that are put together to work towards an outcome that you really want. It can be a process that requires a very large set of skills and a wide variety of skills to be successful. So we're not just talking about coding as an action, as a thing. We're talking about it being built up as a set of skills that can be used to code successfully, but can also be used to do a lot of other things that get you to that desired outcome successfully. It can be an activity that can use technology. So Erin held up the Photon robot as we started. I think she's going to do it again. There he is. So when I think about this definition, or one of the definitions of coding as an activity that can use technology, we can find ways to use different types of tools or different types of toys that integrate technology. So it can be something that does, oh, mine is turning off, that can kind of go with technology. It's an activity that, and this can't be stressed enough, always uses problem-solving processes and skills. There's not going to be a time where you come across a coding task or a job that involves coding or a classroom activity that involves coding where problem-solving doesn't have to happen. And with problem-solving comes another slew of skills that are needed in order to do that successfully as well. So really, we can see that coding is not just the person sitting in the black room or thinking about maths and sciences. It's a lot of different skills that can be brought to light. And it's definitely filled with different opportunities to persevere. I don't know, Erin, thinking about you back in school too, or thinking about when you became a professional, that there were times when you had to push through challenges, you had to push through things that didn't go right for you the first time. Can you think of like some times that actually that happened?
Definitely personally and professionally, but thinking through back to the students I taught in the 11th grade specifically, I was really focused on supporting them in working through their New York State regents or accomplishing these performance tasks and applying for college. But as I thought back to how coding could have supported my students and, built their resiliency skills, it's something I've learned a lot more about and how to support that through other mediums that may not be the obvious ones that are connected to my subject too.
Yeah, and I think too, I kind of like heard some of the things you said there in terms of engagement, wanting our kids to be able to build these skills in an engaging way. And again, too, thinking about us as professionals and in whatever capacity that we are interacting with the educational sphere. That perseverance is really important. We've all been in situations where we've had to push through something that didn't come quite easy to us. And as adults, we have, for the most part, we probably have some skills that get us through there. But as we're getting up to that point, there's some road bumps. So it's important to do those things too. And we also talk about how coding is present in the classroom right now. It doesn't have to be that a coding program is introduced to a district or a classroom or through a program. It's right there in the classroom. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how the skills that are involved in coding are already happening. And it's a matter of kind of shifting your mindset of how you see them happening in the classroom. So when we think about coding, it's not just in those black computer screens or in those dark rooms, or when Erin and I first saw it or thought about it in our careers, but it is really everywhere in our world. It has to do with our cars. We see it when we go into stores. We see it when we come to work, or how we interact with coworkers. On our phones, we see the different applications and web-based products that we're constantly using. And all of these have code behind them. So your children and the people that you work with and other places all have some kind of interaction with coding on a daily basis. We wanted to put out some stats for what's going on in the coding world right now. 25%, there was a study done where 25% of the parents that were surveyed said that they wanted their children to learn how to code. And that's a pretty big chunk of people. So thinking about the things that parents want their children being able to grow up with, yes, they want them to be able to do the act of coding, but allowing children an opportunity to do that brings about so many more skills. Engineering and coding were the top two skills that parents wanted their children to learn, and their types of jobs that they wanted their children to get, which, as we know, a lot of those jobs are very lucrative too. So I think that there's something to be said behind that. Erin and I were talking about this statistic a little while ago because we were both kind of shocked by it, that only 47% of United States high schools teach computer science. So we think about the fact that coding is everywhere around us. We think about the fact that technology pretty much rules our lives at this point. I'm sure that most of us, if not all of us right now, have a phone near us in our hand. Maybe we're even watching this webinar on our phones, or we have a computer sitting in front of us, a laptop, whatever. But 47% of all high schools are teaching kids how to do and use computer science. So I think that eventually down the line, that kind of tells us that there could be some gaps in the people that we have entering the workforce with the knowledge needed in order to continue our society functioning the way that it is. Another really interesting and cool fact that we found was that 70% of coding jobs are actually in non-technology fields. And that's part of what we're here to talk about today too, is that coding doesn't just live in these technology spaces, but it can also be a part of many different areas. So to think that if somebody were to get a coding specific job, it's not necessarily going to be in a technology field. And we were looking at Outlook statistics too. So the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics released their job forecast for 2020 to 2030. And they're looking at a 13% increase in computer-based jobs, which is pretty big, and a 22% increase in software developing, QA, analyst, and tester jobs. So the need and the desire is out there for these jobs. And it's kind of shocking to see that not all of it is being introduced everywhere in our country. So that's pretty interesting. So when we think about coding being everywhere, we think about it as being a growing field everywhere. So coding and technology-based jobs are becoming bigger, digitization of jobs and services. I'm sure we've all been to restaurants or stores where there's no longer cashiers. There are computers that you go and you check yourself out at. I know Target's like the big one that you always go up to the self-checkout counter too. Erin, do you go to the Target self-checkout counter?
Definitely, and groceries are really helpful as well.
Yeah, it makes it a little bit faster. And speaking to that too, that we think about how coding's affecting that, it's making our lives a lot faster. We can do a lot more things when we have computers that are able to do them for us, whereas coding is really needed. And we're also seeing a huge need in the growth for 21st century skills in not only the classroom, but the workforce. And this speaks to collaboration. This speaks to technical skills. This speaks to perseverance. This speaks to resilience. This speaks to a lot of different skills that are not just skills that our children need academically, but they also need to be able to function in our society. So some of the real world examples of where we see coding happening are web development and software developer jobs. We see a lot of arts and design jobs also calling for people to have coding skills or coding knowledge in general. So we think about graphic designers too. So engineers too, obviously, are people that are definitely going to need some coding too. So these are some really big jobs, very lucrative jobs that are calling for coding to kind of be a skill that their job entrants have. And we are going to be speaking too about how all classrooms are involved in coding, whether they realize it or not. And that was something Erin and I were discussing before the webinar too, is how us as educators, before we realized it, or before we kind of, took some time to think about our practices in the classroom, is that we were doing a lot of these skills that coding brings into play. So we were coding teachers without really even noticing it. So it's involved in all academic areas, including reading and writing and our arts and our world language classes, our physical education classes. We do see coding becoming part of our STEM and STEAM initiatives too in classrooms. We see codable devices such as Photon, good old Photon's back, and other kinds of tools and toys being brought into schools that allow students an opportunity to use different types of code, varieties of level of coding. We see a lot of online coding platforms as well coming about. And we see technical, collaborative, and critical thinking skills too, that are needed not only just in coding, but also in a lot of different things that our students are doing. So we want everybody to just take a second to kind of consider these areas where coding might be influencing our lives. So we want to think about how coding could be influencing our world and our global community. How could it be influencing our homes and our lives in our homes? And how does it influence our educational spaces? So I think about the world and the global community. I think about how I or people around me are connecting to people in different countries. How are we able to do that? Well, somebody has to be programming our Gmails and our Microsoft and all those other things where we can send emails and transfer pictures and communicate with people all around us. Personally, I use for my house, I have an Alexa device. So for her, she makes my life really easy at home. She controls my lights. She controls a lot of the things that happen in my home. And in my educational space, I think back to my students and who I had in my room. And I used a lot of different technological devices to kind of engage them in some of the things that might not have been as fun. For example, something like reading. So take a second. I want everybody to kind of think. You can pick one of these categories if you'd like. Just share something in the chat for how you think coding might be influencing our world around us. Let's see. I wonder if anybody's going to agree with me on the house robots. Yep, Simply Safe. Yep. So pretty much anything you're using on that web definitely has code. Cats during the day. Yep. Well, lets us keep an eye on our pets. And speaking to that too, you're also keeping an eye on your personal possessions, because chances are it's also in your house. So you're able to kind of monitor what's going on from far away. That's perfect. Yep. Apps running new fancy appliances. We were almost going to buy a refrigerator that told you when you were out of something. We didn't.
I love smart bulbs for my home, which I think goes into the idea of fancy apps for the home as well. I love being able to say, hey, Google, turn on the lights or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's a great point that Dan points out, because I don't know about you all, but the minute my technology just doesn't work the way I want, whether it's, opening up a web browser or loading a site takes a few seconds longer than normal, it's incredibly frustrating. So it's really insightful to know what's going on in the background, and we need people to make that work. But also from an end user, that's in my mind the kind of actually really taps into what we're talking about today. We're gonna preview talk about critical thinking and problem solving processes. So how can we help debug in a sense and build that resiliency to figure out, okay, if it's not working, what's going on? So absolutely.
Yeah, I agree.
The Ring doorbells as well.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, and we think about too, and I see Jenny, you're mentioning, you'd kind of be afraid to think of who would be hacking into your phones or messing with it too. And we think about that as being a connection that our world and our global community has. I don't know if you're Apple users, but this morning we all got a message saying that we needed to download an update on our phones. So thinking about that too, because there was something going on at Apple, but you're thinking about how the global community is also affected by the things that are going on in the computers that we're using. So thinking about that too. So there's always those kinds of concerns. As great as this technology is, there also are those concerns too. And that also brings in a lot of those skills that we have in the background with coding, that, you have to be aware of some of the capabilities of the things that you're doing. Mm-hmm. So as we kind of continue through, you can continue thinking about how coding, maybe before this, you weren't really thinking about it. Now we've given you something to think about here, but how coding really is present in many facets of our lives. So I'm going to wrap it back to that idea that we said that coding skills can be in all classrooms and in all educational spaces. And that's a really big idea, especially if you're thinking to yourself along the lines of, well, I've really only seen coding talked about in a science class or a math class or a computer class. Kind of branching out and shifting your mindset to think about that idea is pretty big. So we're going to kind of go into the idea of how is this possible? How is it that coding and coding skills, and I'm making that differentiation between the two because it's really important to know that there are skills that allow us to code and allow us to do those things that are equally as important as the action themselves. So how is this possible that coding can be in all of our classrooms or all of our educational spaces, and we might not have realized it from there?
And building off of the how is it possible, what is that really, concrete strategy that you could take back? What I know a lot of people are joining us today as tech directors, whether you're coaching or presenting to teachers on how they could do this, or thinking about the curriculum choices that are and tools that are being used in your school. What are just really, not necessarily simple, but it's meant to be something that could be done by everybody and done over and over. So we're going to really look at a concrete strategy that we're going to be able to use. So with the idea of bringing coding skills into our classroom, the reason we're doing this, building off of all the things that Jess has said already, is because the prerequisite skills that are used when our brains are engaging in coding, the act of coding, are the same skills that we need in our life, in the classroom, as a professional, to be able to be prepared to pursue any opportunity we want our students to do. And that was huge for me when I was teaching, wanting to be able to give equal opportunity for students to pursue a path, whether it is any career of their choosing. They may be the end user of all these cool codes, or they may be the people coding, but how am I preparing them to be critical thinkers, to be responsible consumers, to be able to build the skills they need to pursue and define success, however that looks for them? You can go ahead and, yep. So with that, we're going to start to unpack some of these 21st century skills. You may have heard this term, or it may have just been used through conversation, or you may be able to name some 21st century skills. But essentially, what are the skills that our students need to tackle today's problems, and not only today's problems, but also future unknown problems? And we've seen this over the past 2 years, the need for those in the workforce to be flexible, to be adaptive, to be resilient, and for things that we may have not predicted, or maybe some people, I'm not sure, but we want to be able to prepare our students to be able to continue and be successful beyond their years with us in school as well. So with that, there's tons of 21st century skills, and I'm sure this list is going to keep growing. Some of them are here listed here, and there's more. There's no kind of one list of 21st century skills from what we've researched, at least. So whether it's patience, creativity, communication, collaboration, as you're hearing these words, possibly reflecting on what are the skills that you're using as an adult now, whether it's in your career or at home or in any other aspects of your life. Leadership, technology literacy. Every time my phone updates, I need to be able to re-navigate and understand how to access what I need so I can access my email or communicate with those that I need to communicate with. So since this is a huge list, this could be overwhelming for people to think about, how I've got to teach geometry and I have to teach phys ed and all these other things that I have to teach in addition to all these skills. So what we're doing is you can see the arrow here, filtering down to these 21st century skills to think about what do we want to start with in our classrooms? Where is it reasonable? Where is it realistic? And what is a good high leverage starting place? So we've broken these 21st century skills down into 4 categories, or buckets rather: problem solving, engagement, resilience, and critical thinking. And for today's webinar, we're going to really focus our conversation in on problem solving. And this is a great practice. These are 4 buckets of skills that we may want to support our students with all year long. But we're going to start with something that is a good first start in being able to know that we're building skills with our students, and it is also more realistic to building into our curriculum. So when we're thinking about supporting our students' problem solving ability, which we're going to tie back to coding, we are going to unpack the strategy of computational thinking. It's a process, but we're naming it as a strategy because it's a way that we can support and build our students' problem-solving skills. So when we're thinking about computational thinking in terms of the context of this webinar and coding across the curriculum, computational thinking in that problem-solving process is bolstering the prerequisite skills that students would need in order to code. So with computational thinking, I've mentioned already, but it's a problem-solving process. It's steps or a sequence of steps that students and anybody you'll probably recognize how you do it in your adult and professional lives as well, goes through in order to problem solve and plan and overcome any challenges that they're facing. I also like to name this as a high leverage strategy, particularly because when you're using computational thinking, it's not something that is done as an activity with your students just one time during one particular unit in one particular subject or grade level. High leverage here means that any teacher you work with in your space or you yourself can work with computational thinking at any time, in any class, with any grade levels, in any subject, and really at any point in the curriculum as well. This is something that you might do at the beginning of the week and at the end of the week, or at the beginning of the unit, end of the unit, or along the way and throughout the year. So, and that's just something we look for a lot when we're thinking about how we can bolster these skills, is what's something that we can do over and over and really help our students practice and begin to master those skills and continue to deeply develop them so we can give them feedback and really leave a more meaningful experience on their education, because it's not something they're just kind of doing in passing. It's something they really get to practice and reflect on and be able to build their skills ultimately. So with computational thinking, we're going to unpack the process a bit and the terms. So the first step is decomposition. This means that whatever the context of the problem is, it's breaking it down into smaller pieces. It's very similar to what we just did. We said there's a lot of skills people or students rather, or everybody needs to be able to transfer into their adult lives. The collaboration, the tech literacy, the creativity, all of those skills. That's super overwhelming. Let's just break it down into smaller pieces. Like we did, we identified or categorized the 21st century skills into 4 buckets. Then pattern recognition, seeing trends or similarities. So being able, and that was part of the process we did to even break down those 21st century skills into buckets. We had to be able to categorize them, make sense of them so we could manage them better. So we've got pattern recognition. And then thirdly, we have abstraction. This is when we would be removing unnecessary pieces to focus on what's important. How can we kind of filter out the irrelevant information and make sense of it, or pick what's most important or prioritize what's needed now in order to then begin to find a solution? And lastly, after going through our steps, being able to participate in algorithmic design. This is where we're essentially creating a plan. We're building a list of steps. We're sequencing what we need to do. We've prioritized what we want to focus on. So whether I'm writing a recipe, whether I'm writing a lesson plan, or whether I am determining how I'm going to get from be able to run all my errands on a Sunday, especially with stores closing at an early time, I'm going through this process of computational thinking. So as you're thinking about how this might relate to your life, some of the things that you do, now as adults, computational thinking may be way more automatic. When we are doing laundry, we may not have to necessarily think twice about what we're doing. If you ever catch yourself kind of in zombie mode where you're like, oh, I just did a whole load of laundry. I didn't even realize, you have to separate your clothes potentially, and then you have to put them in, set the temperature, in my case, a pod, and be able to execute whatever it is you want to do. For our students, those skills are still developing. So being able to create spaces where students are intentionally thinking about the process that they're going through. My 11th graders may not have to have thought about the process of tying their shoe, but maybe Jess's kids who are a bit younger, we're going through that. So you're building those intentional moments where they're practicing, they're getting the feedback, and then it builds that automaticity. So in thinking about computational thinking, whether students are already doing it, we're going to consider how can we bring that mindfulness or that intentionality to it, so we're reinforcing that skill and ultimately preparing our students to enter the workforce as possible coders or critical thinkers who are ready to engage in any path they choose. So we're going to look at how coding could look rather across different subjects. Some of the more obvious ones might be possibly math or computer science or science. So we're going to look at 3 subjects today that you may not have considered coding to be relevant in, or maybe you've seen it being used in your school and would like to explore that further. So we're going to use 3 examples of music, physical education, and an English or literacy example. But when you're thinking about these examples or how they may relate or how you might even recommend them to somebody that you're working with or in your own practice, we're going to consider what was the activity and how are students intentionally practicing too, that computational thinking routine, the practice of decomposition, identifying those patterns, abstracting irrelevant information or define relevant information, and ultimately making a plan. And we're going to look at examples of how this is done with explicit coding examples here with the Photon robot, which is a coding robot that also has a coding platform through its software and applications, but also how this is done without explicit coding tools. So how we're practicing that computational thinking in what we call an offline coding way. So for our first example here, we have a music lesson. So anybody play a musical instrument now or in their school age? I played the saxophone and the violin. Oh, great, violin.
Clarinet player.
And I was pretty good at reading sheet music, but I had a really hard time memorizing music. And I was actually in the marching band in my school, and we had to memorize all these songs, and you could not bring your sheet music with you when you're marching on the field or down the street. So I I quit, I can say that, a bit earlier than I think I would have liked to, but I really struggled with the memorizing of music. So as I'm thinking through how music education could be supported coding, or how my own education could have been supported as well, I'm thinking about how could I have experienced memorizing music or practicing or really understanding how notes are related to each other in a way that was different than just, looking at each note and trying to ingrain it in my memory. So here with this activity, students are practicing their scale. It's a C major scale. And what they're going to be doing is mapping the scale or writing the scale on this enlarged whiteboard map. And as students are drawing their scale, they're going to be working in a group. And what they're also going to be doing is they're going to be using the Photon robot, which can be coded to change color. The antennas on the robot, it's a little bit light on my screen here, change color at intervals. And with this association of color to notes, students are starting to think about music in another way. So if it doesn't quite resonate with them exactly where a note falls on the bar graph or the chart, students will be able to start to use different parts of their brain to build those association. Most people that I know that are really strong in music tell me that they actually see music in color. So their genius that they're tapping into or they have around music, being able to bring that out with the coding robot to be able to see that in different ways. You can play that video, Jess, to see it in action. And students are not only coding the robot to move up the scale and change colors at time, but they also had to plot the notes in the correct positions on the chart. And actually, for an added bit of challenge here, they scaled it to be 2 or 3 times larger than the actual size of the scale as well. So they had to do a bit of transposing there. And a big piece of this, when we're thinking about that intentionality of going through computational thinking, students were working in a group, but they also have reflection questions. What made this easy or challenging for you? How did you overcome those challenges? And how could this activity help you with composing music in the future as well? So with this activity, we've shown you the end task and also the product of what students had made. But now thinking back to the idea of computational thinking, how are students going through that problem solving process? So first, anytime students get a problem they have to solve, a task, a prompt, they have to go through the process of decomposition as they have to unpack the prompt. They have to think about what is it they're being asked to do, what's the problem they need to solve. And as they move through the different steps of, for example, pattern recognition, they had to think about, okay, well, if I need to make the C major scale, where do I put the notes? How do they follow that pattern of where they go on the actual chart between half steps or whole steps or absolutely. So then abstraction, being able to figure out, okay, what are the notes of the C major scale? Even with the task itself, what is the relevant or irrelevant information that will help me accomplish this as well? I know that maybe I don't need to use the sounds that Photon is capable of making. I need to use color instead. So being able to have students go through that abstraction process and ultimately making a plan so they're able to determine a solution and then execute their plan successfully, or maybe not successfully, which is okay too, and then being able to reflect and learn on it, which you saw in those reflection questions.
And I think it's important to point out too the fact that they're not always successful the first time they do it, or reminding educators and teachers that when students are going through some of these coding processes and these thinking processes, that part of it is being able to fail and then kind of get up again and try other solutions. So that is part of those skills. So sorry, I'm jumped in on you there, but I just figured that was a good little point to point out.
Absolutely. And I see in the chat too, I was just catching up from after I was sharing all the information that you all have, especially the idea that Dan shared of stimulating different senses. So I didn't know that information. So thank you for sharing. So here with any other 21st century skills you could see being supported in this music activity, or any other connection to coding that you could make that you haven't shared yet in the chat, please feel free to do so as well. And I just want to add on a little bit there too, with that reflection piece, that's giving students that opportunity to, after they've gone through a process, kind of pause and reflect on, okay, I just went through this process. How have I changed? Or what was the impact of that experience on me? That's where that intentionality comes in. We call it, it's made a bit more sticky in the brain, or the students creating those synapses to be able to build their working memory and their schema. So the next time they encounter that challenge or something similar, they're starting, again, they have that development, so they're able to approach it in a different way or apply what they've learned to a new context as well. And that's what coding does. And not an expert on AI either, but as I'm learning a little bit more about AI with Photon here, being able to understand how those are similar type processes. And Jess, we'll do the phys ed one maybe, and then go to Q&A.
Sure, absolutely. So I was really excited about this one because I feel like the phys ed department sometimes doesn't get as much glory as they deserve. So thinking about some of these areas where, you might not consider some of these technical skills coming in is great. And Photon kind of helps us do this again. So for this physical education task, it was all about how do we do a layup. Now, I by no means am a layup professional. I scored one basket in basketball in 4th grade, and it was like the shining moment of my parents' life. I'm sure some of you have felt the same way. So when we think about these classes, we think about some of these skills that we can help our students kind of perfect. So here, we would be developing the sequence of a player and how they would go through performing a layup. So we're talking about another sequence here. And what we would want them to do in this task is to create a graphic, some kind of visual, detailing each step in a sequence and what it should look like in action. So how they would document taking somebody from beginning to end of the sequence of going into a layup. And again, connecting it back to coding, we think about how code is how we build something together to create an end. And this is exactly what we're doing. It might not necessarily need a Photon to do it, but we're still going through those skills. So for this lesson, we had Photon actually coded to run something that would show off how to do a layup. Now, obviously, he's not jumping or doing any of those things, but we looked at him and we tried to think about, okay, if we were having somebody code something here, what would it look like? What actions would somebody have to go through to perform a layup? Well, they would probably have to walk forward. They would probably have to turn. There would be a moment where the basket was shot, and then there would be a moment where they turned away from the basket. So we have Photon here. We've constructed a visual graphic here on the bottom that shows that sequence of performing a layup. So again, we talk about reflecting. We think about what was easy or challenging for us in this. Now, this could have been something where you have students that fly through it, they're good, no problem. But after running some code or allowing Photon to run through something like this, there are probably some moments where there were some issues with getting him at the right angle or getting him to go forward or make a noise. So revisiting and having to go back through that process is really important when we're thinking about that computational thinking. And thinking about how do we overcome, how do we persevere through this, and how could this activity then lead to somebody thinking about how it would help other activities or other skills that might be needed. So when we break it down, we think about how do I unpack the prompt? What did I have to do? Well, biggest thing I needed to do was detail the steps of a layup. And what were some of the patterns that we saw here? Well, we saw that each step is going to get us closer to the basket, and it requires the learner to move their body in different ways. So while we're not talking about patterns like color changes or numbers, we are seeing that something is happening in order to get us, it has to happen over and over again in order to get us to that means. So for the abstraction here, we think about what is this kind of speaking to? Well, we think about games versus practice. These layups need to be practiced in order to be applied to games. We need to use them in games in order to win. So we see that kind of relationship happening. And we're talking about a team element. So if you know anything about basketball too, that sometimes a player has to feed into a layup, throw you the ball, you have to go in and do it. And talking about how to support somebody as they're practicing or as they're getting better at this skill as well. So when we look at this task, when we break it down and we look at what needed to actually happen, first thing you want to do is some research, watch somebody actually do it, slow that process down and document it step by step. And then you're able to create your visual. In this case, it was with Photon. It could have been done in a bunch of different ways. But as you kind of reflect here, you notice that there's a lot of different skills that are at play. This person would have had to really persevere if they got stuck on something. There could have been a collaborative effort here. There was some technical skills involved, being able to use Photon and the robot, being able to kind of use their executive functioning, kind of prioritizing what were some of the things that had to happen first. And when I think of coding, again, I think of step by step. When I code something, I have to put in a sequence that's going to get me to the end. Here we did it with the robot, but if we were to take the robot away, we could even see that I was detailing a process step by step by step. And if one of those steps was off, then we would have had a problem and the layup wouldn't have worked quite as well. So we have a couple other examples with literacy. There's so many different things that you can do. If you want to take a really quick look at some of the things that we kind of brainstormed about how coding connects into these other areas of academics, you can see that we really can make these coding skills work anywhere. And it's not just about being able to use a computer and being able to get something from point A to point B. It's really about building and bolstering and supporting those skills, not only with just students, but also giving our educators the tools to be able to do that in their classrooms as well, which is as important as anything, being able to support them in their journey and shifting that mindset that coding isn't just for our math and our science teachers, but it's actually for all of our teachers, which if it's for all of our teachers, then it's also for all of our students at the end of the day. So as we're moving on, thinking about next steps, what are some things that you can do to kind of get the ball rolling in this process? Well, the first thing that you can do is try to think about using computational thinking in your space. This could mean that if you're in the classroom, you can try it out with a lesson. You can kind of break down some of the things you're already doing. If you're more of an administrator type role, or you're overseeing a program in your company or in your educational space, thinking about how can you support computational thinking with the people that you're working with, or even in the space that you're in. You can join our Facebook group. We do have a community. Talking in a professional community always helps. You can see even here on the chat, we all learned a little bit. Thank you guys for all bringing your knowledge that you have about so many different things. But please feel free to join our Facebook group so you can continue those discussions there. You can think about researching some coding tools that can be brought into your space. We were lucky enough to have Photon with us today, Erin. Yes, Erin's the Photon keeper. But having a chance to look at Photon and maybe even requesting a demo and trying the apps out. He does have free applications that can be downloaded. So that would be something great you might want to check out, which you can also touch base about getting a demo of Photon. And you can also continue engaging in professional learning with my Eduscape. That's a great platform to use. You have so many different resources on how to use Photon and other great tools in the classroom. So we want to just take a step back now, give some time for Q&A. We want to thank you so much for being with us today. And I'll turn it back over to you, Kate.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just oversee the chat now for any questions that we might have. I want to thank everyone again so much for being here for this session. I hope it's been really helpful for you. I mean, for the teachers who are here, I hope you're all thinking about how you might be able to integrate coding into your own classroom. If you're a tech director, maybe you're thinking about how bringing coding or bringing this concept to the teachers in your district could help your school have maybe more meaningful technology integration in the classroom with some of the technology that you've been implementing. And I hope you're all starting to think about stuff like that. If you are having some questions about how you might be able to do that, we would love to be able to partner with you for that. So we have contact information up there. Anna Hanrahan is Tripara's representative for Eduscape. She can help set you up with my Eduscape or Photon and help you learn more about those solutions. But I turned on our exit survey. Take the time to take that on. Otherwise, ask any questions you might have in the chat here. We'll make sure our presenters, which thank you again very much for you two for being here.
Thank you for having us.
That was great. So any questions you might have for them, pop them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself at this time, whatever you feel the most comfortable with. But thank you all so much for being here.
And I see there is a question, but I just wanted to share too. I just put in the chat a PDF with the hyperlinks from our slide with all of the next steps that you could use to take away as well. And I see a question about, has Photon ever been used at the high school level? So Jess and I both can speak to this, but Jess, you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, sure. So yes, that's the question. The answer is yes. So Photon, the coolest thing about Photon is that we call him the robot that grows with you, because he has the capability of working with our like before reading level children. So we're talking about pre-K all the way up through high school. He has different coding capabilities inside of his app. It goes from a joystick movement. So you can actually have on the screen a little joystick and it moves the robot, and you can drop in actions for color changing and sounds, all the way up through text-based coding. So JavaScript, Python. So there's really some versatile things you can do with him. And again, a lot of these coding skills can be built over time. So we say that he grows with you because as students grow and they gain more knowledge and skills, they can move on in the different coding platforms that are inside of Photon's software. So it's really pretty cool. He has a bunch of different kits that are offered as well that go through into high school. We have a physics kit that presents lots of really cool toys that Photon interacts with, and some really great lessons that support that as well. So, so that the brief answer is yes, he does, and there's a lot of really cool things that can be done with him.
I love Photon.
He's the best.
He can be used even when you're in your 20s. I think he's a blast.
Yeah, and it's great to learn right alongside your students as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm not trained in coding necessarily, and I've built a lot of fluency in it, and being able to you know, not feel like I had to master the tool either when I put it in front of my students, but rather be able to have them help explore, you know, providing the structures where needed, but also providing that space for them to explore, because I'm sure you can think about your own children or your students and how quickly they can learn products now as well. And there's a question about sample videos. There are absolutely sample videos. On the website is probably a good place to start, and Photon's YouTube channel and YouTube videos as well. I can think of an example for one where students have a map of the US and they're telling the story of Lewis and Clark, and Photon is traveling across the same place and at each point stopping at points of interest and sharing the facts from that. Tons of examples, just that was the one on top of my mind as well. And through a demo, we're happy to share some more examples through it as well. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, if there are no more questions, I just want to say thanks again so much for everyone being here. You can contact Anna Hanrahan for any more information you want about Eduscape or Photon or just any kind of professional development, or if you're just interested in learning more about this topic, you can reach out to her, you can reach out to Jessica or Erin. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks to our presenters. And we have 2 more sessions coming up about coding, STEM, robotics, and we will send more information in a follow-up email about those sessions. So if you liked this one, we have a couple more coming up. So I hope to see you at those ones too. But thanks again so much. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.